Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have a reaction request video 111, the second orc invasion, the Mannheim Gap. This is part of Arch Warhammer's War for Armageddon series, and is requested by Samuel. So, let's check this out. Ready, and... play. Oh, then go through. Play. Dun, dun. Dun, 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 dun.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and
Greetings.
welcome back to yet more 140k lore and the War for Armageddon. We have already covered the main flashpoint events of the war, the battle for Hell's Reach, the surprise assaults, and the massed engine battle in the Diabolus Manufactorum district.
Okay,
But when covering the War for Armageddon, there are a few stories we can't ignore.
Ooh.
And specifically, that means talking about the Celestial Lions, also referred to as, mostly by me, the Starry-Eyed Pussies, the Twinkling Kitties, and most fittingly, the Nyan Nyan chapter of the Meow
The
Startings.
Nyum Nyum chapter.
Basically, the backstory for the Celestial Lions was written by a dude who just finished watching The Lion King and said to himself, this would be an excellent backstory for a chapter of superhuman religious mass murderers. I mean, just listen to these special titles. Spirit Walker, Life Binder, Death Speaker, and most fabulous of all, Pride Leader.
Oh, gosh.
That last one in particular, my oh my. I know, I'm picking on the poor shiny felines, but I mean, look at them. Are there any two colors that go worse together? I mean, gold and shiny cobalt blue. He
I've
even
seen
has
worse.
screaming cats' heads for exhaust ports. I'm sorry. I will try to compose myself, but you have no idea how hard it is for me to resist the temptation of simply just making a 30-minute video with nothing but Nyan Cat playing in the background. Because, I mean, look at them. By the God Emperor's ass whiskers, all I see when I look at the Celestial Cougars is this. Oh, and I'm pretty sure I have a picture of their chapter master around here somewhere as well. Here we are. Terrifying,
Nice.
isn't it? Okay. I'll behave, I'll take it seriously from now on. It's just that these cobalt-headed G-Cats have got to be my least favorite chapter ever.
Oh, yeah?
And that is despite the fact that they have a pretty cool backstory, which we will be getting into here, but the visual style just triggers me timbers to a downright catastrophic degree. Any meows? Let's carry on.
Oh, cat
The
puns.
secret channel of Rogal Dawn's Imperial Fists, created during an unknown founding late in the 38th millennium. Little of their founding years is known. Presumably they served the Imperium ably enough whilst pissing on trees and batting bundles of yarn around on their spaceships. The first proper mention of them is during the subjugation of a relatively minor revolt on the planet Qatar and the surrounding systems. The planet used to be a shrine world, an entire planet given over to the worship of the Emperor. Usually these planets are turned into shrines after an act of great religious significance has been carried out, for example, the birth of an imperial saint. Alternatively, planets can be turned into shrine worlds simply by merit of being owned directly by the ecclesiarchy, who holds the right to a fair few such planets used to provide the ecclesiarchy with various resources.
That's
food,
understandable.
Money, or perhaps specially qualified servants. In the case of Qatar, however, I suspect it must have been a shrine world rather than one owned directly by the ecclesiarchy, because it is mentioned that the planet's PDF forces joined in with the rebels.
Oh.
As many of you may remember from my Sisters of Battles video, the ecclesiarchy is not allowed to have any men bearing arms.
Yeah.
and that rule stretches to the PDF forces as well.
Oh,
if an
really?
Ecclesiarchy planet is in need of protection,
I didn't know
it is
it
either
spread to
protected by
them.
Adeptus Sororitas convents, massive fortified castle churches that don't fall far short of Astartes fortressed monasteries when it comes to their ability to protect the planets they are on, or, in the case of less important planets, they might be garrisoned by Imperial Guard regiments, though generally speaking, the Ecclesiarchy is not particularly fond of that solution,
Yeah.
as it essentially hands power of the planet over into the hands of the Administratum.
Yeah.
Potentially, the planet could also be protected by religious zealots, bands of militias/mercenaries, essentially. Although this tests the limits of the Administratum's ban on men under arms. Technically, these formations of volunteers and religious zealots are not under the direct command of the Ecclesiarchy. As such, they are not technically men under arms, but, well, that is one hell of a technicality, and generally speaking, the Ecclesiarchy cannot expect the Administratum to overlook such a technicality for all that long at a time. Anyways, Shrine Worlds, however, are quite different. As far as the wider Imperium is concerned, it is not, by definition, an ecclesiarchy world, even if it is de facto ruled by a priestly class. An example of this would be Macabus Quintus, homeworld to the Maccabean Janissaries. The planet is de facto controlled by a priestly class, and is classified as a shrine world, but by definition, it is still a regular imperial world, overseen by the Administratum. And as such, there's no issues with the planet having a PDF garrison, and even raising regiments to the Imperial Guard, which would probably be under the sway of the local priesthood, though of course the Administratum is always a little bit extra wary of these regiments not growing too much in numbers, and generally speaking will send these regiments far afield to make sure that they couldn't cause any trouble should there be some friction between the Administratum and the priests of their local homeworld. Back on Kitten Tar, the ruling class of priests had gotten a bit out of hand. You know, the usual devil worship, blasphemous orgies involving various farm animals, human sacrifice, and perhaps the most vile of all, the invention of another 63 genders. So clearly a Slaneshi-flavoured heresy there.
What?
By the way, if you're curious, I have it on good authority that Slaneshi flavour tastes like raspberries with a hint of pear. Anyways, the Slaneshi infection spread like spunk in a public bath, rapidly and disgustingly, corrupting those unfortunate enough to be touched by its malignant aura, and driving them yet further into depravity, much like the aforementioned example. Luckily, the friendly neighborhood Inquisitor was around to put a stop to the spread of such unwholesome corruption. A man by the name of Apollyon, fuck you, GW. Interestingly, fuck it, the Inquisitor didn't have any ground forces, which is odd. So all he could do was enact a naval blockade. I presume he'd already wasted the guard regiments, since it would be extremely unusual for a Navy task force big enough to blockade a system to not have any guard forces whatsoever. So, in the place of the good old IG, Inquisitor fuck his name called in the Celestial Lions. The Nekonekonyanyans must have had a particular hatred for tentacle pornography, because they sent the entire chapter to go rip some cultist ass. And that is most certainly what they did. Sending an entire chapter to subdue one rebellious world is much like beating a mouse to death with a fully loaded dump truck. Messy, loud, and extremely comprehensive.
Wow.
After less than a month, the rebellion was well and truly crushed. All centers of military resistance had been thoroughly pawned. Although, unusually for the Sons of Dorn, the Lions had destroyed any and all military resistance, even local militia forces, yet had left the civilian population virtually untouched. Huh. They must have been formed from the gentler parts of the Fists Legion. Generally speaking, the Fists have a fairly relaxed relationship with collateral damage, especially when said collateral damage is at least tangentially heretical. After the military campaign was concluded, the Lines began the process of withdrawing from the planet, while the Inquisition began the job of checking the local population for tentacles, or extra assholes, or anti-police genders, and so on. They must have found something, though, or perhaps considerable amounts of all of them. After the Lions had left the planet, and were well on their way out of the system, Inquisitor Bagonhead ordered the planet cleansed. On his orders, all population centers on the planet, big and small, were reduced to dust by orbital bombardment. It is worth noting that this was not the ultimate sanction of Exterminatus. The planet itself was not to be destroyed or rendered uninhabitable, but its population had been deemed to be beyond even the Emperor's mercy, and as such, the only other option was to grant them his redemption in the cleansing form of nuclear fire.
Nice!
Population numbers are unclear, even more so after the war, but at the very least we are talking about tens of millions, possibly even billions of Imperial citizens. The Celestial Lions were outraged by the Inquisitor's actions and demanded the bombardment be halted. Again, are we entirely sure these are Dorns, boys? This is the kind of fluffy-hearted softiness I would expect from Vulcan's lizards, but still, it could be argued that they were less pissy about the millions of civilians popping and fizzling on the planet-sized barbecue the Inquisition had created, and that they were, in fact, more pissed about the fact that they had taken the planet, bled for the planet, and expended vast quantities of ammunition taking it, and now their efforts appear to have been wasted. Regardless of the reason, the Astartes do not have the authority to countermand an Inquisitor's orders, and although Inquisitor What's-His-Face offered his sincere regrets that the Astartes had been required to waste time and effort on a planet that in the end could not be saved, he remained adamant that the order was necessary. Now, it is hard to say with any real accuracy whether the Inquisitor overreacted here or not. The fact that it was a shrine world, and yet it had still succumbed to the lure of chaos, suggests that the taint must have run pretty damn deep indeed.
Yeah, pretty deep.
On the other hand, the infection was apparently mostly located in the top levels of society, in the clergy. This means that it might be reasonable to suspect that the greater population might have had some protection from the infection by sheer virtue of social distance.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the planet itself was not deemed to be unsalvageable, so it is unlikely that the corruption had any real roots in the planet itself. In fact, the planet would probably be renamed, reclassified, and eventually repopulated. Perhaps the population could have been saved, but perhaps it was simply better to make sure. It does sound pretty inhumane to kill millions of people just to be sure, but the taint of chaos should never be underestimated. Whether or not the Inquisitor's fears were justified or simply paranoia, the fact remained that the Celestial Kittens felt that their honor had been sullied. And from that moment onwards, they would be vocal opponents of the Emperor's Inquisition, calling their actions into doubt and even going so far as to question their motives in a highly public manner. And I do mean highly public manner. They sent messages, envoys, and communiques to anyone who would listen, and even sent an envoy to Terra to lodge their complaints with the Inquisition directly to the High Lords.
Wow.
Unsurprisingly, the ship had an accident on the way and never made it. Even so, the chapter continued bitching loudly and clearly to anyone and everyone, and it is, as I have always said, bitching solves everything. Though you may want to reconsider the solution that might be created from said bitching, since you are complaining at the most powerful organization in the Imperium. Because remember, there's always at least two solutions to any problem. Namely, the assassination of the bitcher or the bitched at. And so, once again, we return to Armageddon, and the Second Orc Invasion, where this particular confrontation would come to a head. the entire Celestial Alliance chapter were deployed to the planet and primarily assigned to the defense of High Volcanus, where shit started going wrong pretty much immediately. There's an old saying that goes something like, "Don't shit where you eat." And the Lions had essentially deployed a long, steamy reel of cat poop directly on top of the pointy-headed hat of the Inquisition. And the Inquisition are directly connected to the people responsible for providing the various Imperial forces with their battlefield intelligence. You know, part of me really admires the Lions' sheer backbone for taking on the Inquisition, but my god, are they some silly kittens. The Astartes possess the authority to piss right in the morning coffee of a staggering number of high-ranking Imperial officials, but the Thundercats had decided to urinate into possibly the one and only cup in the entire galaxy that was capable of pissing right back. And so it did. Ferociously so. The Celestial Lions were time and time again sent false and misleading information, sending them into the middle of massive ore counterattacks or placing them in exposed positions. The Lions' rates of casualties far outstripped that of any other chapter due to this misinformation. And when the chapter tried to rely more on their own scouts, the poor kitty cubs were usually found brutally murdered, if they were found at all. Additionally, the chapter continuously found themselves exposed to an unusual amount of technical difficulties. Their short and long-range vox would constantly be jammed. Their communication with their fleet elements would be likewise interrupted. They would have, at best, occasional contact with their fleet in orbit. Said fleet risked much to try and get their own intelligence down to their brothers on the surface. Many of their ships were lost trying to take high-orbit reconnaissance footage for the troops on the ground. Additionally, the ships suffered from constant malfunctions and breakdowns. Vital orders would either not be received or simply not be acted upon. This resulted in the loss of several Celestial Alliance vessels through accidents, miscommunications, and sheer mishap. For example, the Celestial Lions might be unable to keep formation with the rest of the fleet because they simply did not receive the orders to execute a maneuver. Their navigation equipment might be messed with. Their short and long-range voxes might again be destroyed or at the very least interfered with. The strike cruiser La Vie was destroyed after colliding with the Flesh Tearer's flagship Victus. The La Vie had thought it had several hundred kilometers of clearing to the crippled Flesh Tearer flagship. However, their instruments were simply not telling them the truth. In just a few weeks, the Celestial Alliance fleet's complement had been reduced to 3 ships. And things were about to get worse. Resupply and intelligence from said ships were about to start drying up rapidly, as several more mishaps began happening. The chapter's supply crafts would be given incorrect coordinates, landing miles away from their Adeptus Astartes allies, occasionally even being routed over enemy flak locations. 3 Thunderhawks were shot down in error by Volcanus' anti-aircraft batteries because on their scopes the Thunderhawks showed up as Orc fighter bombers. And while certainly some of these mishaps could be written off as accidents or simple mishaps that do happen on the battlefield, these mishaps were getting uncomfortably frequent. It's not like the Celestial Lions are the Lamenters or anything, and this was not by any stretch of the imagination normal. And it was about to come to a brutal climax when the Lions received the orders to attack the Mannheim Gap, a canyon running through the mountains north of High Volcanus. Now, you might be wondering why the Celestial Lions even bothered listening to orders at this point. It was rather obvious that these orders were not to their benefit. However, the Celestial Lions, again, they're striking me as an odd chapter of Dorn. The Lion's pride required that they followed the orders of high command. This strikes me as far more of a salamander thing. The Imperial Fists, although they will make efforts to work with Imperial command, they are rarely this subservient. In fact, you gotta remember, the Black Templars are an Imperial Fist's founding chapter, and generally speaking, they treat all mortals with a certain disdain. Now, of course, there are vast differences between the various founding chapters, as they were often formed from various pieces of the overall Legion with very, very different views on the world, but this really, honestly, does not strike me at all like the Sons of Dawn. They seem almost subservient, although you could make the argument that this might be their final sting to the Inquisition, their final way of saying, look, we are loyal. We are in fact so loyal that we will follow these orders despite the fact that we know it is to our own detriment. Though I do think that is a rather naive stance to take. The Imperial Inquisition is wholly convinced of their own righteousness. They are literally the agents of the Emperor himself in their mind, and they could not possibly be mistaken in any way, shape, or form. So if that was their aim, I doubt it worked out very well. And so, after a little under a month planetside, the chapter had been reduced to half strength, with only a little over 500 Marines remaining. And these 500 Marines were now ordered to enter into the Mannheim Gap, a canyon filled to the brim with orc gargants. They had been informed by Imperial intelligence services that the gargants were not yet operational. The Lions had attempted to confirm this for themselves, and it would appear as if the Gargants were non-operational, as if they were still being worked on and could not yet move. They could not hit the area from orbit due to crude orc void shields, and any scouting into the area was limited at best due to the Celestial Lions' inability to keep their scouts alive for any kind of extended period of time. As such, with their limited intelligence at their disposal, the Lions decided to strike quickly and with overwhelming force, sending the entire chapter barreling down the valley, hoping to clear out all the Orc defenders in one massive strike. And everything considered, that is not a bad idea. They don't have enough intelligence to really do something fancy. They can't be certain that they could communicate if they tried to do something fancy, and in that kind of a situation, it might simply be best to rely upon the superhuman abilities of the Adeptus Astartes to smash through all opposition and simply just kill the enemy a whole lot faster than they can kill back. And to make sure that they had plenty of oomph, the entirety of the Celestial Lions' remaining armory was also deployed. Land Raiders, Predators, Whirlwind, Rhinos, Razorbacks, you name it, whatever the chapter had left, they were throwing it into this one operation, hoping to break the back of the Orc defenders quickly and decisively, allowing the Lions to walk out of yet another hopeless engagement. And to begin with, it looked like everything was going more or less to plan. The Lions assaulted the enemy compound with the full ferocity that they are so rightfully known, and were successfully inflicting massive casualties upon the defenders. However, to everyone's unending surprise, the Gargants were not actually non-operational, and quickly began wandering all over the compound, stepping on Lions and blasting them to smithereens. And as if that was not enough, it would appear that the Orcs knew they were coming, and had prepared thousands of other Orcs to lie in ambush, waiting for the Lions to come into view. Now, this in and of itself is not unheard of for Orcs. Orcs do have a crude but effective grasp on the idea of ambush tactics. And while asking an Orc to stay still and not run screaming towards the sounds of boom and bang when there is action going on is difficult, to put it rather bluntly, if you threaten them with a sufficiently heavy piece of cast iron wielded by a sufficiently strong Orc, they will actually keep still for a limited period of time, and that is exactly what had happened here. Thousands of orcs began emerging from their hiding spaces and attacking the lions. They were now surrounded under attack by gargants and thousands more orcs than they expected. They were in deep, deep doo-doo. And then, orc snipers happened. Now, of course, the mere suggestion that an orc would know what aiming is, much less sniping, is in and of itself fucking ludicrous. An orc would consider the mere act of attempting to hit something on purpose to be downright heretical. The primary purpose of a ranged weapon is to create vast quantities of light and sound. When it comes to killing things, that's up for the dude with the choppers. Don't get me wrong, if they occasionally happen to hit something with their ranged fuselage, then that is of course a bonus, but it is not in and of itself the goal of shooting. Additionally, these orcs apparently were equipped with scavenged las cannons or something, as they were drilling neat little heat holes in the helmets of various officers. And if you think the idea of an orc aiming is ludicrous enough, now imagine an orc capable of recognizing Astartes' insignia and actually picking out officers because it knows that's smart. To put it rather bluntly, the people pulling these particular triggers probably weren't very green. Realizing that they were getting rather violently butt-sexed, the lions began a fighting retreat, and actually somehow managed to punch their way out, which in and of itself was quite the goddamn achievement. However, at the end of the engagement, only 3 high-ranking officers were left alive, and only 1 apothecary. Without the apothecaries, the lion's gene seeds could not be retrieved, and as such, the chapter's numbers could not be replenished. The single surviving apothecary did not live through the night. He was found in the morning slumped up against the hull of their last remaining Land Raider with a hole drilled neatly through his head. Now, personally, I'd like to ask the lions why they weren't all collectively sitting on top of said apothecary, but hey, Astartes. They're not always the most tactically minded of people, especially the chapters that decided to take most of their insignias from a Disney movie. And now that their fate was more or less sealed, the Celestial Lions saw no other option than to die gloriously. But at least so that other chapters would remember them, and to bitch a little bit more at the Inquisition, they sent one final communique via a manual recording on a craft towards Hive Hellsreach to get in contact with Grim Al Darkus himself, the biggest, meanest, ugliest bag of emperor-bothering violence this side of the Eye of Terror. Because we all know who's on the other side of that particular sphincter, don't we? Come to think of it, he also had a little bit of a run-in with the Inquisition. Which seems like making them your enemies is generally a stupid goddamn move. Anyways, the Storm Eagle didn't make it to Hive Hellsreach, although in this case in particular at least, it seems that the Inquisition might have been blameless, as the pilot tried to fly during the Season of Fire, an unusually uncomfortable period of time to be trying to stay airborne for any more than 6 or 7 seconds at a time. Luckily, Grimaldus did at least receive the distress signal and went to investigate. When he got over there, he got a hold of the emergency recording and figured out that it was from the Celestial Lions chapter. After conferring with the higher-ups in the Black Templars, it was decided that Grimaldus and one other Marine would stay behind and go down to Hive Volcanus to try and figure out what the hell was going on. The rest of the fleet at this point was going to go after Gazgul, who had fled the planet since, well, he'd gotten bored basically and just left. We'll get into that in the costs video, which will happen after my vacation, so just in case you didn't know, the channel will pretty much be quiet for the next 2 weeks. But all of that aside, Grimaldus and his favourite butt buddy in black ventured down to Hive Volcanus to see precisely what was going on. He was quickly routed to the Celestial Alliance base camp, which was a heavily fortified structure on top of a natural rise in the environment. Upon their arrival, the 2 Black Templars were welcomed by the Celestial Lions, or at the very least what remained of them. At this point, there were only 96 Celestial Lions left alive, and in the good old name of dramatic convenience, Grimaldus arrived just in time to see the remaining Celestial Lions loading up every single piece of hardware they could get their paws on, and preparing to banzai charge their overly shiny asses back into the Mannheim Gap. Grimaldus was welcomed into the encampment by Pride leader Ikini Dubaku, with Pride leader being the Celestial Lions equivalent of a squad sergeant. Normally, he would be in command of a single squad, not what was essentially at this point the remainder of the chapter. The Lions proceeded to tell Grimaldus of all of the bad things that had happened to them, and naturally that they suspected that the Inquisition was behind all of it, which, let's be honest, is probably a pretty damn safe conclusion. Grimaldus and his little friend Cynric argued that the Lions should endure the shame of retreat back to Elysium to rebuild their chapter. The Lions refused this, saying that if they tried to do this, the Inquisition would almost certainly just follow them. Grimaldus also kinda had to agree with this, since he knew that the Inquisition were probably trying to set an example here, and I do think that is a rather correct estimation. Now, I do not think that the Inquisition as a whole necessarily was trying to set an example, because you gotta remember, the Inquisition as a whole does not really exist. Individual inquisitors have the authority, and there are only a handful of senior inquisitors that can claim to speak for the actual Inquisition. And honestly, if somebody like an Inquisitor Lord had decided to fuck with the Celestial Lions, it probably wouldn't take the form of something so subversive and sneaky as sabotage. Because while that certainly does send a message, it does not send anywhere near the message that simply excommunicating the chapter would send. And make no mistake, it is well within an Inquisitor's Lord authority to excommunicate entire chapters of Astartes for very little in the way of transgressions. Anywho, the Celestial Lions had made up their minds. They would throw themselves at the Mannheim Gap. They had requested the aid of the Black Templars, but they were leaving right about now, so that was not going to be an option. They had also requested the aid of the Flesh Tearers, but they had taken a pounding barely second to that of Celestial Lions, so they could not help either. They had therefore requested Grimaldus to give them their final rites and allow them to go to their deaths, safe in the knowledge that they would receive the Emperor's blessing and his benediction. Grimaldus refused. He left the Celestial Lions encampments that very day and went back to Vulcanus, where he contacted several Imperial Guard commanders stationed in Hive Hellsreach, along with Navy personnel, and proceeded to order, threaten, cajole, trick, and occasionally even smooth-talk these various commanders into redeploying forces to Vulcanus and the aid of the Celestial Lions.
Nice!
Now, you might be saying that this went well beyond the authority of a Reclusiarch, and you would be entirely correct. A Adeptus Astartes Reclusiarch has, in all due technicality, absolutely no authority over the Imperial Guard or Navy, whatso-bleeding ever. An Adeptus Astartes chapter master might have limited authority over these forces unless he has decided to call himself the overall authority, like Dante did during the First War. But generally speaking, a Reclusiarch is a religious title. He is essentially a super chaplain, and they, generally speaking, are not given vast battlefield authority beyond their own chapter, and hell, generally speaking, they don't have a command authority even within the chapter, but, well, the Templars are rather zealous. Nevertheless, Grimaldus was the hero of Hellsreach. As such, his words carried a hell of a lot more weight than just the fact that he was an Adeptus Astartes Reclusiarch, and he managed to gather up a fair bit of an army to help out the Celestial Lions with their assault upon the Mannheim Gap. His reasoning was that the Celestial Lions could not abandon Armageddon and go back to Elysium because the Mannheim Gap existed. It was their secret shame. their final defeat at the hands of the Inquisition, and as long as it was occupied by the Orcs, the Lions would not leave.
Makes sense.
Therefore, if the Mannheim Gap could be neutralized, the Lions might be able to see some sense and go back home to Elysium to rebuild their chapter. Dubaku did not really see it that way. He viewed Grimaldus's actions as a intrusion into Celestial Lions matters, and he was not at all happy. In fact, he went so far as to yell at Grimaldus, and considering the fact that this is a man who has woken the dead back to life with his ire, Grimaldus is not the kind of person you want to be bitching at. The simple fact that Dubaku did not find himself on his backside 15 feet away with a splitting headache is a sign of just how much Grimaldus respected the young lion cub. Nevertheless, there would be no refusal. Grimaldus would not allow it, and so the Celestial Lions, the two Black Templars, and the Imperial Guard set off once again for the Mannheim Gap. It was hoped that most of the Gargants that had been under construction had wandered off to go make the Imperium's life difficult some other area, and for the most part, this was true. The Orcs had turned the Mannheim Gap into a massive Gargant construction, repair, and maintenance facility. And while most of the Orc walkers were away, there were several who were still there, either undergoing maintenance, repairs, or down for R&R. Orc R&R, which basically means the crew was probably mostly dead, and currently in the process of being replenished. The Imperial forces immediately set upon the Orc defenders, hoping to use much the same strategy as the Celestial Lions. The crude void shields over the area were still intact, and as such, no real strategic finesse could be employed. Additionally, the Celestial Lions had said that they would be setting out for the Mannheim Gap that morning, regardless of what happened, and they could probably not be dissuaded, so they didn't even have time to scout the area out properly this time. Luckily, the forces from Hellsreach had brought quite a lot of oomph, and by the way, don't worry, Hellsreach was at this point under no real threat and had been heavily garrisoned. It was not anywhere near as battered as we last left it, so in all due likelihood, Grimaldus had not severely weakened the defense of Hellsreach, and even if he had, Hellsreach currently had a far more effective protector than any Imperial Guard regiment, namely the Season of Fire, making any kind of assault upon the city pretty much guaranteed suicide. Additionally, these were probably relatively small Gargants, along the lines of Stompers, etc., and they were brought down relatively easily by massed artillery barrages and a few super heavy tanks, although, by saying relatively easily, I'm saying that they still killed probably a few thousand Imperial Guardsmen before they were brought down. The fighting was close and very, very uncomfortable. The Orcs no longer had the element of surprise, but this had now been turned into one of their primary maintenance yards for Gargants, which means it was very, very heavily defended, and considering it was placed inside of a valley, the Imperial Guard was almost certainly having to force their way through the valley or atop the high sides of the valley. Either way, they would almost certainly be fighting very close to the Orcs, which is not the place you want to be if you're an Imperial Guardsman. The casualties were astounding, and the Celestial Lions did not suffer any less. In fact, at one point, Dubaku was the only Celestial Lion still fighting and fully functional. He would not remain that way for long, however. Reclusiarch Grimaldus, through the sheer animal charisma of his magnetic personality, had drawn the Orc war boss in charge of the defences to him, a monstrous beast, not quite the size of Gazgul himself, but certainly a majestic specimen of the Orc species, and had engaged the creature in melee. Unfortunately for Grimaldus, he had promised Dubaku that a Celestial Lion would be the one to actually kill the beast, as the Lions held this monster personally responsible for the defeat at the Mannheim Gap, which meant that Grimaldus couldn't actually kill the thing. This proved to be a bit of a problem, because the only surviving and still standing Celestial Lion at that point in time was Dubaku, a squad sergeant armed with a chainsaw and a bolt pistol, against a walking tank of a creature that is an orc war boss. It cost Dubaku an arm and a leg, but with the help of Grimaldus, he did kill the monstrosity after a long and harrowing fight. Basically, Grimaldus got on the beast's backs, wrapped his chains of office around the creature's throat, pulled back, a maneuver that would have ripped anyone else's head clean off, but in this case it was just enough to give Dubaku a clear shot at the creature's exposed neck, blowing its head straight off its back. But then we also have a rather interesting little happenstance. You remember those void shield generators that was making it impossible for anyone to insert aerial forces into the area? Well, suddenly, they all exploded, one after another. They went boom, 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 and boom. Mere moments thereafter, Grimaldus was contacted via priority vox link by High Marshal Helbrecht, who reported that the full might of the Black Templars were ready to initiate a drop pod assault on the Mannheim Gap. The Black Templars had not chased after the Beast of Armageddon after all, and had come to the aid of their brethren Astartes. And the funny thing is, no one is entirely sure who blew up said void shield generators. Perhaps it was the Guard, perhaps it was some unnamed heroes amongst the Imperial Guard, men and women that breached their way into the complexes containing the void shield generators and destroyed them. Perhaps it was a sneaky maneuver planned long beforehand by High Marshal Helbrecht, or perhaps, just maybe, it was the Inquisition. Now, it is very, very rare for an Inquisitor to change his mind, and it is even rarer for an Inquisitorial agent to do so, but maybe,
or they just waited
maybe,
to the last second, where there was only
stance
one.
of the Lions, and their absolute refusal to back down in the face of adversity had somehow touched with some last vestigial heartstring in the cold, dead clump of a heart of an Inquisitor, somewhere, somehow. And bear in mind, it might not even have been the Inquisitor that ordered the Celestial Lions to be fucked with in the first place. It might just as well have been an entirely different faction within the Inquisition that decided that this was some silly shit, and that an entire chapter of Adeptus Astartes could not possibly be sacrificed for something so petty. We might never know, but either way, with their warlord dead, and with an overwhelming amount of force raining down upon them from above, the orcs broke, ran, and were slaughtered in turn. The Mannheim Gap, Gargantiards, and the thorn in the side of High Volcanus had been taken, and the final blow against their leader has been dealt by a Celestial Lion. After that, High Marshal Helbrecht himself came down to the surface, walked up to Dubaku, bitched his shit out until the poor brown chapter master was in all due likelihood as Aryan as any one of us in sheer white-faced fear, and made him swear to take up the duties of the chapter master of the Celestial Lions, to return to Elysium, their homeworld, and begin rebuilding their chapter by any means necessary. And I remind you, Chaplain, I can bring you back from the dead by insulting you, Grimaldus considers this man to be his superior. I cannot say for sure, but certain sources have told me that Dubaku did not leave Armageddon with just a bionic leg and an arm, but also bionic ears. It is also a little unclear just how many Celestial Lions were left alive, considering there were 96 when they departed from the Mannheim Gap, the subsequent fighting, and the fact that at one point Dubaku was the only man left standing. It is unlikely that there's any more than about maybe 40, or if we are going to be really generous, maybe 50 odd Astartes, although the number could also be considerably less than that. Now that does not mean that the chapter is completely boned. Each Astartes has 2 gene seeds, one in his neck and one in his chest. Each one of these can be harvested and used to create several more gene seeds. First and foremost, of course, any casualties at the Mannheim Gap would be harvested. Now, it is not always guaranteed that the gene seed can be harvested successfully. It might have been damaged beyond the potential of harvesting. Although this is relatively common for the one in the neck, the one in the chest is protected by the Astartes rib cage, which is a solid slab of bone and extremely tough. Generally speaking, this one can usually be harvested with a fair bit of certainty. So let's assume that they took maybe half casualties, let's say 50 casualties. Out of those 50, some would almost certainly already have had their gene seeds harvested, since they can be harvested after 5 years, or after 10 years via a surgical process. Generally speaking, it is only done so after they are dead, but in the case of long-term serving veterans, it is done as a sign of respect and honor, ensuring that the veteran's legacy will live on with this chapter.
Nice.
So we can probably assume that somewhere between 50 to 100 could have been harvested, and a more realistic number probably somewhere around 25 to 50. These could then be used to create several more gene seeds. Additionally, the gene seeds of the remaining veterans could almost certainly be harvested, because Dubaku had sworn to protect what he could. In all due essentiality, this oath means that Dubaku had promised to stay on as chapter master and not commit his chapter to any further military actions until they were battle ready, which in all due likelihood would mean that the chapter would have to be at least at quarter strength and probably at least half strength before the chapter could be sending out troops to really engage in combat operations again. Which means, again, that the Astartes would almost certainly live to the full ripe age of 10 or 5 years of service. 5 years to harvest the one in the neck, and 10 years to harvest the gland in the chest. This means that at the very least they're probably looking at 20 or so guaranteed gene seeds, which in turn means that they would probably have enough for at least another 40 Astartes, which would then have to wait for another 5 and 10 years to get 80 Astartes, and so on, and so on, and so on. It is a process likely to take decades, but if given the time, the space, and the resources, the Celestial Lines would eventually be back to full strength. They would of course also require a lot of new equipment. The Adepts of Mars would be very busy indeed, supplying the chapter with everything they would need,
hopefully
in terms of armor,
equipment,
ships, drop pods, weapons, equipment, tanks, etc., etc. And of course, this all assumes the Celestial Lions are able to find worthy recruits to begin with, which is a pretty damn big task in and of itself. Finding someone worthy of becoming an Adeptus Astartes, even on an entire world, is not necessarily easy, and recruitment numbers are often measured in mere dozens.
Oh, wow.
And quite a lot of those are expected to die during training. And you can bet your shiny little ass that no son of Dorn will ever lower requirements, regardless of how much the chapter might need the recruits.
True.
The Celestial Nyanyans and Dubaku have a very, very long journey ahead of them before they can even consider stepping a single paw back onto the stage of galactic warfare.
The cat puns.
But thanks to Grimaldus, the Black Templars, and the men and women that make up the Imperial Guard on Armageddon, they just might be able to do so eventually. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, Arch.
Have a good day.
So, that was the second orc invasion, the Mannheim Gap. And that was part of the War for Armageddon series made by Arch Warhammer. If you're not familiar with his stuff, or you just want to check out more of his stuff, there's a link in the description to help you reach his channel. Go check it out. It's pretty interesting stuff. This was recommended by, or requested by Samuel. Thank you, Samuel. Quite entertaining. Alright, so to start out, we learned the basics of the backstory for the Celestial Alliance. Something about a shrine planet called Qatar that had become corrupted, and Apollon, a inquisitor, after the Lions had cleared the planet except for the civilians, he decided to wipe the planet clear of the civilians, essentially keeping the planet for rehabilitation. And this set the Lions off. So the Lions started trying to call the Inquisitors on their BS, which they didn't seem to take very nice because, well, first off, the whole chapter was sent to Armageddon, which was probably seen as an opportunity to mess with the Lions. And after a whole bunch of misfortune that looked suspicious, no idea if it is, being sent false information, having their communications jammed, their resupplies drying up, and all the mishaps. It sounded like just 500 men were sent to the Mannheim Gap, and but when they were there, they were being sniped, and it was possibly by allies. So they were fighting the enemy, and yet they were being hit by weapons that were quite possibly their own, and were quite intelligible shots. Afterwards, there was only 95 left alive of the Lions, and Grimildus came to them and sought help for the Lions because he refused to let this be the end of the Lions, even though he had some agreement with their thoughts regarding the Inquisitors, or the Inquisition. And Dubuku finally ends up killing the boss with a lot of help from Grimaldus, and ends up becoming one of the chapter heads for the rebuild, basically forced into that position. And we have no idea how many Lions are left, but hopefully they can rebuild their chapter, because, man, it really bothers me when there's people from inside picking on people, especially when they're trying to do their jobs. And the Inquisition is easily big enough to justify its own reasons, even if they're complaining. So, call me a fan of the human race, but this definitely seems like a human reaction. Throwing our own men under the fire. Anyways, so regarding the channel, I just released a new video that has a the requested reaction lists 111 through 130. So if you want to see what's next, go check it out. This allows you guys to see what's coming up. Yeah, so exciting. Yeah. Till next time, Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.